First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford. Let's speak to Stephen Reicher, Professor of Social Psychology at the University of St Andrews. He's been part of the Scottish Government's COVID-19 advisory group. Professor Reicher, welcome. Thanks very much for joining us this afternoon. How well are we doing in terms of compliance with the various rules and regulations in these restrictions compared with the first lockdown earlier in the year?
Well, surprisingly, when you look at some behaviours, compliance is remaining high. In some areas, it's even actually getting higher. So when you look at things like, for instance, mask wearing or people socially distancing, it's up 80, 90%. And this isn't just what people say, because people would say they would do it, wouldn't they? If you do systematic observations, there are people who spend their time sitting at the London train stations counting how many people wear masks. So that is pretty good. But there are some areas which aren't good at all. And one of those areas is self-isolation. If you're contacted to be and asked to self-isolate, it seems that actually very, very few people do that, as low as 10%. And what that suggests is this isn't simply a matter of motivation. It's not that people don't want to comply. It's that in some areas it's very hard to comply. To self-isolate, for instance, well, you might lose your job. You might lose pay. What do you do if you live in a house with lots of other people of different generations? How do you deal with caring responsibilities? And what it suggests then is that rather than blame people or think that people have ill will, it's much more important to support people. And I think if government is seen not to wag its finger at us and berate us if we don't comply, if government supports us and we see government as a partner, we're much more likely to comply.
How important, then, is the kind of language that gets used about violations, particularly by politicians who, we're just about to wait to hear the Health Secretary this afternoon. The kind of language that he chooses to use, how influential is that?
It's very important. Because, as I say, I think the way to get through this is through a partnership between the public and the government, in which each takes its responsibilities seriously. And if the government takes its responsibilities to support us seriously and to inform us clearly, I think people will be much more likely to go along with it. Instead, we seem to have something of a finger-wagging government, which tells us off, which says it's our fault, which threatens us with punishment if we don't comply. The implication, as I say, being that people have ill will. And I don't think that's really helpful, because if you treat the public as the problem, if you treat them as other, you stop that sense of partnership, of common purpose, of common group membership, which is the key to compliance and is the key to motivating people to comply with the rules.
How important is someone else's behaviour on the perception of your own? And if you haven't been to a house party and had one of those mass gatherings, you might think, well, whatever I do, it's never as bad as that.
Well, again, I think there are two different things here. First, I think we need to look at the role of the media. You see, people might be surprised to hear that things are going relatively well in some areas, because the stories we hear are stories of non-compliance. A headline about a house party is far more likely to hit the headlines than a story about people sitting quietly at home. And so we overestimate the extent to which others aren't complying. And secondly, then, that leads us to think, well, if nobody else is complying, what's the point of me doing it? It sets a norm which undermines compliance. But still worse, if you misrepresent the problem, if you say, look, the problem is large house parties, then the danger is that people say, well, I'm not having a house party. I might be seeing one or two more people than I should, but they think they're not the problem. And indeed, there's evidence to support that. So a while back, the Scottish Police released figures showing that in 1 week, they do this every week, they've been to 440 house gatherings. Of those, only 13, less than 1 in 50, less than 2%, were large gatherings. And when they knocked on the door of those who are having 1 or 2 more people around than they should, they'd say, well, why are you knocking on our door? We're not having parties. So in a sense, it's the accumulation of small violations that rather than a few big violations which are the problem. And so I think all of us have got to look to our responsibilities. The government to support us, the government to be clear in their language and clear in their guidance, and for us too to take this seriously. Because after all, if we don't take the restrictions seriously, all we do by increasing contact is increasing the transmission of the infection, which means that these things drag on and make things worse for everybody, for us, for businesses, for the government, for the community as a whole.
I feel chastened on behalf of all of the media now. You're quite right. We don't report on people sitting quietly. Just finally, I've got broad shoulders. Finally, and very briefly, if you would, how are we doing on trust in the government and trust in politicians?
Well, we've talked of a reset. The government has talked of a reset, and Dominic Cummings, who in many ways is the symbol of the breakdown of trust, after he broke the rules and was protected by the Prime Minister, giving rise to a sense of one law for us and one law for them. Basically, trust plummeted. In 1 week, it plummeted 20 points. And since April, when trust was at about 75%, trust in the UK government has plummeted to 30%. And that's really worrying, really concerning, because we need trust more than ever, especially, for instance, in people having trust in taking the vaccine. So the reset I'd like to see is a reset of trust. And I think that depends, again, on a pivot from the government acting in a rather paternalistic way, wagging its finger at us, to a partnership approach, seeing the public as part of the solution, not part of the problem. As I say, I think that's absolutely key in moving forward.
Professor Stephen Reicher from the University of St Andrews, thank you very much for talking to us.